Welcome to the Father on Purpose podcast, featuring author and ministry leader Kent Evans and business executive and military veteran Lawson Brown. This is a show for you, Dad. You want to be a godly and intentional father. Unfortunately, you've turned to these two knuckleheads for help. Let us know how that works out for you. Before we begin, remember this: you are not a father on accident. So go be a father on purpose. Please welcome your hosts, Kent and Lawson.
Hey, Dad, sometimes it's tempting to feel like as a dad, we have to be perfect. We can't ever make a mistake. We got to get it all right. We got to keep everything in balance. We got to use every minute of every day perfectly and to its greatest maximum ROI. We don't need to be perfect. We need to be faithful. And there is a huge difference between the two. Dad, you're not called to never make a mistake, but you are called to be faithful. Now, before we dive in to talking about that subject today, which sure resonates with me as Lawson and I were kicking it around, I'd love to remind you, we have a new sponsor of the show.
I can't say it too loud because she's in the other room, but Olivia's birthday gift is supposed to be delivered tomorrow from Range Leather. So super excited. They are so cool, man. They've got great stuff.
You have great stuff. And you know what we ought to do is just always talk about them like in our whisper voice, just for fun. That's the new thing now. Hey guys, it's rangeleather.com.
Do not tell anybody. Don't tell anybody about Range Leather.
Turn the volume down for this next part.
Make it like it's a
fun.
secret. Like, don't tell anybody. You know, if you want something to spread, don't say anything.
My nephew works for a company, and they're probably going to order a bunch of hats from Range Leather. And so,
we appreciate them. Seriously.
We love these guys. So go patronize their business. And if you're driving through the great city of Laramie, Wyoming, drop in and go visit. They have a great storefront.
Heck yeah. So Kent, what do we hear from dads?
Well, I think a lot of dads feel the pressure to get everything right. And to some degree, that's probably true for everybody. I mean, once you realize there's a standard and once you realize you can't quite live up to it, you can start to map that onto your heart and your identity. And then you start to live out of this kind of fool's chase of trying to be perfect. And you start to think, well, you know, I was angry at the kids, and so I'm probably not a good dad, or I wasn't kind to my wife, and so I should just quit being a husband. You get into this downward spiral because you're not perfect. But what we see in Scripture is, while there's this call to walk worthy, to be diligent, to pursue righteousness, no question, there's also this idea that over time, our lives and our hearts should be marked more by faithfulness than perfection. I have a friend in Florida named Jeff, and Jeff and I were talking, and he said, yeah, you know, I'm kind of moving to having faithfulness be my measure of success. It's like the language that he's using is he doing the things that he feels like God's called him to do? And for us as dads, that's a really important, it's a nuance in how we approach fatherhood, but it's a very, very important mind shift if we can move toward faithfulness and away from, you know, just this endless striving for perfection.
Yeah, it's definitely, you know, something that if you like, I went to Open Bible and just put faithfulness in,
Right.
And there's a list you can just scroll and scroll and scroll forever. I mean, it's clear that we are directed, you know, to be faithful. I do think though, you know, let's take a pause and just kind of think about faithfulness before we get into the conversation about faithfulness over failure or over fear or, you know, whatever. God is faithful. We can strive for faithfulness, you know, in our walk and in our understanding, right. but he will always remain regardless, he will be faithful. He will outlast us in faithfulness. He will be first in faithfulness, and he will be the most faithful. You know, we as dads can follow that calling and do our best, but we're going to fail. We're going to fail in our faithfulness. We're going to fail in what we're trying to do. We're going to fail in the way we handle issues in our personal lives, you know, much less with our children or with our wives. But to return to faithfulness, I think, is something that over time you begin to learn, and you begin to trust. I think faith comes before proof. It comes before hope. Remember Bob Russell, who we've had on the show before, long time pastor at Southeast Christian there in Louisville. I remember a sermon once. He said, faith is going to the edge of all the light you have and then taking one more step.
Wow.
And knowing that your foot is going to land on something solid,
Yeah.
Now that's faith. That is what we're called to have. Faithfulness, you tell me, faithfulness is more the living of it, the carrying it out, that sort of thing, regardless of whether you are faced with failure or success. Faithfulness is that state of being, I guess.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
And they come from that same Greek root word, pistis or pistis, and it's talking about this idea that God said something and we believe it. And that because we believe it, the faith is the noun, if you will. The faithfulness is the characteristic or the adjective that should describe the person who believes it. So if someone were to describe you or me as faithful, it should be because we have exercised faith. Like, if you were to describe me as arrogant, it's probably because I did something that was arrogant. Or if you were to describe me as funny, it might be because I cracked a joke, so you would use a descriptor to describe me. And I would love for my wife and my boys to be able to include the word faithful among the descriptors that they would use for me, right? Because what it would mean is not just I was a good guy.
That's right.
It's not just about being a good guy, which sure, why not? But it's about the fact that my life was marked by moments of faith. I remember when April and I were dating, the first few years we had some challenges, and wasn't always just, wasn't always just the two of us. It was people around us that created some challenges, and it was not an easy courtship in that regard. There were some storms around us, and we've talked often about how we hung in there, like together. We walked through that challenge. We've talked about sickness in our marriage. We've talked about financial challenges that we've had, or those early years when our kids were really young and we were sleep deprived. We made it through. And sometimes the coming out on the other end of a trial is something where you go, oh man, that person is faithful. They were faithful because of how they walked through a difficult season or a challenge. And what they're demonstrating, when you call them faithful, what they're demonstrating is a commitment to a higher purpose. They're demonstrating a perspective that looks above the circumstances. And so, man, it's just a really neat word in the New Testament that Jesus used often to describe people. And I'm looking forward to diving into it more today with you. What are some other thoughts you have on this topic as we get rolling, Lawson?
I have a tattoo I got in the Marine Corps. It's the Marine Corps motto is Semper Fidelis, which says always faithful. And I think that's not a declaration of something, that I am. It's a striving. You know what I'm saying?
Interesting. Okay.
That's kind of how I think about it, and like you put in the show, there's something you put in the show notes that I'll talk about. But first,
you mean the part where I put Lawson only talks for 3 minutes? Is that what I put in the show notes?
Right. Yeah.
Gave you an extra minute.
Good
Let's
one,
go.
Kent.
Clock's ticking.
Good. You crack me up, Kent. A straight face.
I also put that in the show notes. You're supposed to say that too.
Maybe I didn't say it with the right inflection. Isaiah 41:10 says, "Don't worry, because I am with you. Don't be afraid, because I'm your God. I will make you strong and will help you. I will support you with my right hand that serves you." It doesn't say, be faithful because everything that you want is going to work out the way that you hope for. Yeah. And, no matter what our field of what's in our world to care for or to show faithfulness with, like you put in the show notes, there's a big difference between me and Billy Graham, for example. but that doesn't mean that my small portion is any less important by any
Yeah.
stretch. It is to be faithful in what he has for us.
Well, and there's a really exciting reward if you think of it that way. You know, again, we could debate whether you should love people for the reward, or you just do it for the love of doing it, right? But I think of that verse, Ephesians 2:10, where it talks about God has prepared in advance good works for us to do. For some of us, you know, it may be, well, I'll use my own context. I've written a couple books, three to be exact, and or two and a half, if you want to look at it that way. I co-authored one, and none of those books have sold millions of copies. However, yet,
Yeah, I was going to
yet,
add none of. Well, go ahead.
however, even if they didn't or never did, I believe God wanted me to write them. I believe it was the thing I was supposed to do. I believe it's almost like acreage. I kind of think of it like acreage. He gave me this, like, 4x4 area to garden and to hoe and to get the weeds out and to fertilize and plant. And I did a great job. Others might have been given a 400 million acre area, like it's, and they're going to be held accountable for how they farmed and handled that acreage. I'm not going to be accountable for that because that was their acreage. And you mentioned Billy Graham, here's a guy who for the last 100 years, probably nobody had more evangelical touches and had more impact. But that was God doing that through him. It wasn't that he was 14 and just said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to talk to 100 million people over the next 60 years. Like, that wasn't his. He didn't just invent that. That's God. And sometimes I find that dads need to be reminded that if you're a dad and you're listening to this show, it means God's entrusted a lot to you, a lot. And you may think, well, I don't know, I've only got this tiny house and, two broken down cars. And that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about your marriage. I'm talking about your fatherhood and your children. What's more valuable, a brand new Tesla or a baby? Right. It's not even close. That's not even a fair comparison. Right. And sometimes we think, oh, well, I'm not running $1 billion enterprise here. Well, you're doing something even more important by stamping the image of God on the heart of the blank slate called the baby you were given. And so for us as dads, man, we got to realize that the field he's given us, our 1 kid, our 2 kids, our 10 kids, however many, and our wives, those are really important acreage, and we're going to be held accountable for how well we farm it.
Yeah, well said. I told you I'm kind of off this week, and we have some friends who came down to visit. They got a condo here down at the beach, and we've been hanging out. And literally last night at dinner. So, and they have 4 kids. They brought their youngest, Fiona, with them. She's 17, and just a wonderful kid. I mean, she's just a joy to be with. And, you can just tell she's got this she's older than her years. And we were talking last night, just the parents of us were talking about, the mom said, while she was talking to Audrey and I, that they've learned that they can give Fiona quite a bit of leash, they can let that thing run out pretty long. Even when they know that she's going to be, I don't know, like out with some friends or whatever. And they've met some of these friends, and that helped them feel like, we can even let a little more leash out. Yeah. Now, look, I'm not a proponent of putting your kids on a leash. I'm just teasing. But
the metaphorical leash.
I know, you see them in the airport nowadays.
I'd love to see some parent with their 17-year-old daughter and go, look, if you don't get it right, we're not even going to let you go to the bathroom by yourself. This leash only goes so far.
Right. But we were talking about, it's not a matter of is as they're, let's go with that metaphor. She's mature, she's focused, fun, friendly, all that. Right. And this leash of trust can be extended. And we were talking about how the mom has had the conversation with her to say, look, you are a factor. The way you handle this is a factor in how much, how long it's extended. You help determine that length. And it's not because you're not going to mess up. You're going to, but like, what do we learn from that? And do you on your own, I think this is a key, and I'm trying to get better at this myself as a dad with my own faith and that is there are going to be times where you go, I've got so much, this leash is far extended,
Yeah.
but I feel like I'm coming up into something. I'm going to, on my own, retract it. I'm going to get closer, right?
Nice.
Because I'm not
Yes.
sure.
Yes.
I don't know if I know
Sure.
what I'm doing here. And this doesn't feel like I'm on the right path, for instance. So I'm gonna bring my own self back. I get a kick out of some images. Have you ever you've watched The Chosen, right? That long the great series.
Cover to cover. I'm caught up, man. Cover
It's
to cover.
so good.
Yeah, I love it.
But I get a kick out of the way they portray the disciples in some moments, and like especially early on when they're first meeting Jesus and they get called. I think about them from a standpoint of faithfulness. And then, let's kind of get into this contrasting faithfulness.
Yeah.
But I think about them. They weren't, they didn't have any proof. In fact, Jesus was not the Messiah people expected. They expected this king, this all powerful king.
Yeah.
And he comes in, as this air quote lowly servant. Yet in faith, they dropped what they were doing. They changed their life's path altogether and began to follow Jesus. And what I think about sometimes is, maybe they did. I don't know. It doesn't say they did, sit down and go, all right, so here's the 3-year plan. Here's where we're going. Right. And I picture these guys walking from town to town sometimes and like maybe talking among themselves. This is just a silly thought, but talking among themselves like, hey, where are we going?
Right.
I don't know. I don't know. No
Right.
idea, but I'm following.
Right.
I believe in this guy.
I even think of like Abraham. It said, not knowing where he was going, he got up and went. There's a sense in which being faithful is not just following, a dotted line on the ground and knowing exactly where you're going. I heard a guy explain it this way one time. He said, I feel like God gives you this little pin light, this little flashlight, and all you can see are 2 or 3 steps ahead. And then every now and then, in his mercy and grace, just for fun, he flips on these stadium lights and you look and go, wow. And just as you're going,
that's a good thought.
And just as you're going, wow, he turns them back off. And then you get the flashlight again. And you're like, okay. And so I think there's a sense in which faithfulness, we look backward through faithfulness and we measure it over decades or a lifetime, for example. But looking forward, faithfulness actually is just one step at a time. I think of the time in Matthew 25, Jesus told the parable. If you don't know it, go read it. It's Matthew 25, and he's the parable we refer to as the parable of the talents. And he gave 3 different guys 3 different amounts of money. And then the master went away, and the master came back to settle the accounts. And each of those servants had done something with the money. The first 2 had invested it and doubled it. And he said, nice, well done. And he says this key phrase, I have made 5 talents more. His master said, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. And then the last guy who had given 1 talent to buried it, did nothing with it. And he said, get out of here, you wicked, lazy servant. And so there's this sense in which faithfulness is the degree to which we properly leverage the opportunities that God gives to us specifically.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't have to get into the comparison game. And I think that's where my brain went on today's episode was we tend in America, at least, maybe this is true globally. If you're listening to this, we just got an email today from someone who bought one of our anger-free dad courses in Australia. So if you're listening to this somewhere other than America, email me, let me know if this is true. But I've traveled enough to get the sense that in America, we prize success over everything. And success usually means money or power. That's normally what, if I went to the mall and I said, hey, 100 people randomly surveyed, and I said, define success for me, it's probably going to come in the form of fame, power, or money, is the way culture would tend to define success. And I think there's a really fun way to contrast and to wake us all up a little bit, if we compare success to faithfulness. So like, let me run through a few of these, Lawson, and you stop me about one you want to talk about a bit more. But for example, I think success tells us we need more and more. And faithfulness tells us, hold on, how you doing with what you've already got? So success says you're not enough till you get double. Faithfulness says, hey, how have you handled what you have already been given?
Okay.
Secondly, I think success tells us to chase, go, get, conquer, take, claim. And faithfulness just says receive. It doesn't say Ephesians 2:10, the good works I prepared in advance, that you got to go hustle every day and grind it out and figure it out. That's not necessarily bad to hustle and grind, but I think God says, I'm going to help you by letting you receive the mission. Jesus said, John 6:38, I'll only do what he wills. Jesus wasn't, the classic CEO type, chasing and up at 6 a.m. and bed at midnight, doing it again the next day. He was receiving from the Father. Success tells us win at any cost. As long as you win, all is justified. Very Machiavellian. Faithfulness tells us play the game well. Even if you lose, I'm going to care more about how you play the game than whether you win. Success tells us compare to others. So how am I doing? Has my book sold as many as his book, or is my podcast downloaded as frequently as his podcast? Are my kids smarter than your kids? The answer is they probably are, yes, on that one. But point is, faithfulness tells us compare to our call.
Ooh, I like that.
So for example, am I supposed to run a ministry that aims itself at biblical fatherhood? I think I am. I think for now, maybe forever, that's what God's called me to do. Well, if I'm not out helping people, climb Mount Everest, and I'm not out helping people learn how to scuba dive, and I'm not out helping people learn how to max out their 401k, that's probably okay, because I'm doing what I believe God called me to do. If you want to get out of debt, go listen to Dave Ramsey. You want to climb Mount Everest, go to Nepal. There's other people. The body of Christ is called to do other things. I'm called to do this thing.
Wow.
So if I do it, then I'm winning. Like, I'm being faithful to my call, call.
Yeah.
Mother Teresa, for me, is a great example of an individual in history who was faithful to her call, serve the poor of Calcutta. And then accidentally she became world famous. But it wasn't that became this icon of selflessness and sacrifice and service. But she didn't set out and go, what I'm going to do? I'm going to go in these slums and villages and serve so many kids that I'm going to be on like Larry King Live one day. That wasn't her motive, but that's what happened. Right. And so for me, this is an interesting one, especially if a dad is listening and you've ever worked in business, you're going to know exactly what I'm saying. Success looks at data points. Faithfulness looks at trend lines. So if you've ever studied economics, or if you've ever looked at your stock portfolio or your 401k balance, you're going to have up and down moments, right? Daily technical traders, right? They get up at 8 and they trade all day till 5. They're looking at the technicals. They're looking at the 1/2 and 0.1 and 0.5% changes every single minute of every day, where longer term mutual fund managers are looking at trend lines over time. How's this thing performing on a 1 or 3 or 5 or 10 year history? How's it performing? Success wants to convince you to look at just the last hour or half hour or day. And if you failed in this day, you are a failure. Where by contrast, faithfulness is saying, let's look at the trend line over time. Are we kind of up and to the right in terms of joy and peace and patience and faithfulness? Like, are you moving in the right direction, even though this last hour may not have been your best hour? And so for us, we got to fall in love with the trend line and not get hung up on the data point.
What's going on, dads? Check this out. Hey, in the world of fatherhood, balancing style and functionality is key, right? Range Leather gets it, offering products like the sleek Elbert wallet and the American flag hat. It's perfect for dads on the move. Made from the finest Horween leather, Range's products don't just look good, they are built to accompany you through every dad duty with elegance and resilience. Snag your next dad essential at rangeleather.com and save 15% when you use code MJ15 at checkout. Head to rangeleather.com to get your swag. That's RANGE leather.com. That's a great perspective. We have something at work called the look back report. And it does help bring perspective, because you're not just looking in the moment, in the week, or in the month, and you're not just looking at the most recent trend, but this thing goes back and compares, longer periods of time, so that you can see, okay, we're not wrong. We're headed in the right direction. We may have had some, a downturn a little bit here, but overall, like you're saying, in the trend line, we're moving in the right direction. And I want to make a distinction, not that I think that you explained all that super well. I want to make a distinction, though, that faithfulness is not in opposition of failing. Faithfulness is not in opposition of failing. It's not the antidote, right? Rather, it's an opportunity that can be sought in failure. But it can also be an opportunity that you glean from success. It's not bad to have more. It's not bad to have hustle and to chase. Right. It's not bad to win. And I don't know about compare to others. That can lead you down a pretty slippery slope real fast. I'm saying faithfulness is just itself, regardless of whether you're winning, succeeding, failing. It's going to come and go. The actual instances to be faithful are going to come and go, and they're going to have different results. And that's okay. Faithfulness is the goal. Like we had that Jeff from Florida said he wants to have faithfulness as his measure of success. I like that a lot. Yeah. It's not a, well, if you're faithful, you're not going to struggle with success, or if you're faithful, you won't have failure.
Right. Even the Bible talks about having good success wherever you will go when you trust the Lord. And so success isn't evil. I'm not what I think is our definition of it.
Right.
And so, for example, if you define success as more winning, chasing more, like if that's your definition of success, I would probably argue that your definition of success needs to be informed by faithfulness. In other words, do I die having been faithful to my wife? Do I die having been faithful to my call as a husband? Do I, like at the end of the game, so to speak, when my life is up, or either Jesus comes back or I'm going to die, when one of those two things happens, do we look backward through the lens and go, man, the things, and Jesus said in John 17, he said, Father, I have not lost one of them that you gave to me. I have been faithful. He said, I have finished the race. It is finished. He says on the cross, he came to do a job. He did the job. That is the success that he was after, in a sense, but his success was defined by his faithfulness, not the other way around. And so, for example,
there you go. That's it.
So for example, success would tell us to look at how the crowd evaluates us, right? So we can all point to successful, so to speak, entertainers, musicians, athletes, politicians, CEOs. We can point to them and say they are successful. Why? Because the scorecard in their particular industry is, album sales or downloads or company revenue. Like, okay, a $1 billion CEO is in theory more successful, if you will, than a $15 million CEO, because the measure of for-profit business usually is money. That's what the crowd would tell us. But actually, what God's going to evaluate is his own criteria. It says man looks at the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart. Wow. When you start to embrace that, this scorecard you might have been using for marriage or fatherhood or even business, in a sense, may have been the wrong scorecard. We may have been using a success only scorecard instead of a faithfulness scorecard. The last one I would share is that success often focuses only on the outcomes, the downloads, the sales, the influence, the notoriety, the social followers, where faithfulness follows the process. Faithfulness follows. So for example, there was, all these stories about guys like Michael Jordan who would go and play a basketball game back in the day. And then after the game, he'd go back to the gym and shoot free throws till 1 a.m. or something. And we've got those stories littered throughout the American history, both in politics and sports. And it's just the people who fell so in love with the process of doing their work that results were a natural byproduct of that. They weren't just out to win. They were out to prepare well. John Wooden, the famous basketball coach from UCLA, used to say, everybody has the will to win. Very few people have the will to prepare to win. And man, that's a great phrase, because as dads, we're not going to see wins every single day. Like you can find them. I mean, I look for them, but you may have some rough days, man. You may have some rough weeks, months. But the question is, are you still in the game? Are you showing up for the layups? Are you showing up for the two-a-days? And I'm not just talking about changing diapers twice a day. I'm talking about the things that you got to do as a dad that would characterize you as a faithful dad. And that's only measured over time, and it's measured different than the world would measure it.
Proverbs 3, verses 3 and 4 says, let not steadfast love and faithfulness forsake you. I looked up forsaken. I know what it means, but I like to read it. Sometimes it says, forsaken is an adjective that means deserted, left occupied, or unused. Like if friends have forsaken her, that means they've abandoned. So don't let, Proverbs 3, verse 3 and 4, let love and faithfulness never leave you. Bind them around your neck. Write them on the tablet of your heart. Then you will win favor and a good name in the sight of God and man. It doesn't say, that second sentence, verse 4, doesn't say, then you will have all the success in the world. The success is the faithfulness, right? And
absolutely.
I think talking with our kids, like for instance, in our dinner conversation last night where the mom was talking to her daughter, not in that moment, but she was reflecting back on some conversations they've had about extending the leash, and it's not because in her life she has gotten good grades, made the soccer team, produced, things as a good daughter. It's because she is demonstrating the ability to be trusted. And in that, she has become more and more faithful. It's a process. You don't just accept and believe, and then boom, from then on, in all circumstances, you are able to be faithful. We're gonna fail at even that. But like you were talking about the trend line, and I think it's a mindset that is counter culture, which is what I love about what we're trying to do on the podcast, is offer some useful thoughts for dads to have conversations with their kids to reinforce their own thinking. But the world says you want more, you got to hustle, you got to win at any cost. Compare yourself and compare where you're missing, because that's going to determine where you need. And then, like you're saying, those individual data points, everything can determine your worth, every little point.
Yeah.
Versus the long game, right?
Man.
You also had a couple of points in here. Don't lose these thoughts of success, saying, what do people around you say about you? And I don't trust that. You can't trust that. They are going to get it wrong. And then the last one is, it's about outcomes. Success is about the outcome versus faithfulness being the process.
Well, and what I find interesting, and where I'd kind of like to close today, Lawson, is when we are faithful, we're mirroring the character trait of God, right? So any good character trait that we're exhibiting, generosity, love, concern for others, faithfulness, self-control, there's these character traits, this fruit of the Spirit that is referred to, we're exhibiting the character trait of God. And you and I have talked a lot about there's two ways a dad can listen to this podcast. Through one lens, Dad, you can listen to this podcast and you can see if we've said something that is helpful for you and that you become a better dad, a more loving husband, perhaps, a more generous giver to manhood journey. I'm just throwing out ideas. So, but you can look at it that way and see yourself as like you're holding a bucket and you receive the podcast in your bucket and it pours into your bucket and you pour the bucket over your head and it washes over you and it helps you. Great. That is, a good level one way to engage with what Lawson and I do on the show. Perhaps a second way to engage it, do that first. Don't skip that step, but do that first. But then secondly, the question becomes, how do I translate some of this to my children? So if I'm the dad, do I take the bucket and I pour some of it on my head and I pour the rest of it on them? Like, is there something here for our kids? And here's what's in today's show for your children. If you go back and listen to it, don't let them be sucked into the definition of success that this world wants to map on them, because they are going to be comparing themselves, looking at their social media following. They're going to put out a joke on a Tuesday and refresh and look for how many likes they get by Wednesday. Whoa.
Oh, that's so heavy duty, dude. That's so heavy.
It's amazing when we carry around the weight of defining ourselves by the world's definition of success. And here's the thing, right? We've often referred to this secret man behind the scenes, Hunter, who helps produce the podcast. Well, Hunter is a really good golfer. He's a really good golfer. We've played golf several times together. He would kill me on any average day. And when I'm in the game, when we're playing, if Hunter says something to me that I could do better in my golf game, I listen to him. Why? Because he has demonstrated his capacity to be trusted in that area, right? Okay. Now let's map that onto our children. Dad, if you're not being faithful, if you're wrapped around this world's axle of defining your life by these success measures, when you go to tell your kids, hey, don't sweat the success metrics, just be faithful. You're going to be like me giving golf advice. And that is, should probably not be listened to. So what I'm getting at, right, is step one, man, I sure hope something we've said today stirs a thought in your heart. We've shared a bunch of scripture verses. Go look up God's word. Don't listen to me and Lawson. Go read the Bible.
Right.
But secondly, I hope after translating some of this into your own mind and your own heart and your own life, you go and you give your children this key, this faithfulness key that will unlock some of this crazy pressure the world puts on them to compare and to succeed. Because your kids are living it at a faster rate and even in a greater way than we are because of the thousands of inputs they have in social media and on the internet.
So much harder. Yep.
So Dad, go be faithful. Lawson, close us out, buddy.
I love that, dude. Well done. Very well said. That helped me, and I hope the guys out there listening got something from it as well. Let's go be a father on purpose in faithfulness, and let that be our definition of success. Let faithfulness be what we measure, not an outcome, not even in how our kids come out. We are faithful in all things because He is faithful. See you next week.
Hey, Dad, thank you for listening to today's show. If you found this episode helpful, remember, you can get all the content and show notes at manhoodjourney.org/podcast. And if you really liked it, please consider doing 3 things. Number 1, share this podcast with someone. You can hit the share button in your app, wherever you listen to podcasts, or just call a person up and tell them to listen in. Number 2, subscribe to this podcast so you get episodes automatically. That helps us as well to help dads find the show. You can do that through your favorite listening app, whatever that is. And finally, review this podcast. Leave us a review, good or bad, wherever you listen. Those reviews also help other dads find the show. You can always learn more about what we're up to at manhoodjourney.org or fatheronpurpose.org. We will see you next week.